down from as one of the ancestors and elders that we're probably late because we're starting at 12. So I just want to start out by just shouting out all of y'all for just showing up, right? We're living in a particular moment in our history where it has become apparent to the uninformed that white supremacy is normal in American society. It is also a space where we are realizing that it is actualized not just through behavior, but through our sheer policy. Um, and so I want to use this as a space to not just talk about my time as an academic and the research that I've done, but also use it as a safe space to unravel what you're seeing, what you're feeling, and make sure that it's clear that there are people not in your space or your place who are operating in solidarity with you. Being in Washington, D.C., as you can imagine, um, I have seen a lot. Grown up in Detroit, not too far from the uprising of '67, and old enough to remember leading protests in Detroit when Rodney King was murdered. I come to folks and say, this ain't new. It's just that it's on social media, right? We have always lived in a police state. Like that's just how it is in many parts of our society. But the one thing that's important to keep in mind is that as someone who's done research in the racial equity space, predominantly my predominant framework has been critical race theory. And as someone who really believes that our work in this space, if you want to go back to a good spot to start, go read Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell, right? And so I've said that to folks time and time again. Much respect to the contemporary folks who are doing this work. Go read George Day, DEI, who's at the University of Toronto, as he's talked about anti-racism in education, right? And so I want to, again, give us time to have some dialogue, talk a little bit about the work that I'm leading at Urban Teachers, because I believe that education at its core is a political act, and that education, when done right in the classroom, is revolutionary. And so over the course of time, I've been a classroom teacher, was the second African-American man to ever be a tenured professor at Loyola University, Maryland, and was a research associate at Johns Hopkins. And part of my journey is that I quit higher ed because I just felt like that just wasn't for me. And I quit after I got tenure, and have been back working in schools, and currently the executive director of the Black Educators Initiative, right? Still have a visiting professorship at American University. For those that are active on Twitter, you can ping me on Twitter, get that out the way, at Robert_Simmons3. You can hit me up on email at robert.simmons@urbanteachers.org. And I'll make sure that I follow up with anybody who has any questions, any ways that I can be helpful just as a listener, a thought partner, or just a general rebel rouser with you in the space. And so I want to frame our conversation with some of the work that I've done and continue to do around Black men and boys, having done work and produced reports for such places, the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, which is the precursor to My Brother's Keeper, and having done work at the intersection of education and juvenile justice. I just want to give us some food for thought about some of the work that's taking place in support of Black men and boys. When I was an academic, much of my work was in this space, but I also did a lot of my content area work as someone who was a STEM activist, looking at the experience of Black and brown girls in secondary high schools, and have translated that experience into now being on the board at Black Girls Code. So I think that it's important to acknowledge the intersectionality of experiences, and that the experiences of Black and brown people in America and globally are not always the same, and we are not monolithic. And we have different ways of navigating space and place, but the one common theme is challenges associated with race, racism, and all of the intersectional pieces that play into that. And so I decided to frame this or call this talk considering Tupac's rose going from concrete. I know the title that they had was something totally different, but after I woke up this morning and looked at my two boys in the eyes, I needed to retreat to a space that is one that has provided me comfort over the years, which is hip hop. And for me, one of the greatest books of poetry was the one that Pac did, that talked about the rose growing from concrete. Can everybody see my screen? Just with a thumbs up? All right, cool. And so I just want to make sure that folks see and hear this particular poem. I will not read it to you. That's always the worst form of teaching, is to read something to grown folks. But I will make sure that I leave this up and leave it here for 30 seconds, give you a chance to read it and reflect. So just share out, like, what speaks to you about Pac's words? Just anybody. Just hop in. Don't even raise your hand. What speaks to you?
The thing that sticks out to me is the part that says it learned to walk without having feet.
Mm-hmm. Tell me why.
It resonates with me, like, on a personal level, as someone who I'm Black and Latino. So like, just a lot of us and a lot of the people here in this space like didn't have the standing to be in the place that we are. And so I don't know, like, that's just, I don't know, like, I know that sounds simple, but
no,
it was just like, I didn't have feet to walk and I'm running, you know? So like, no doubt, that resonated with me.
Yeah, shout out to those who exist at that intersection of the Afro-Latinx experience. One of the folks I definitely would encourage folks just to go and check out and listen to her is Rosa Clemente. Super dope, super thoughtful. She had an amazing blog posting a few years ago about why, as a Afro Puerto Rican, why she was protesting the Puerto Rican Day Parade. And it was one of the most well-written pieces that I'd ever seen. So just want to acknowledge that duality of identity for those that are here. Can we get one more person? Like, what speaks to you when you read Pac's words?
One thing that stands out to me is when he says, "Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air." Yes. And it kind of, when you think about like the Black community and Black history, dreaming is what we've always had to fall on. You know, even through like when slavery, we always had to keep our dreams in order to keep moving forward. And that's what really stand out to me, because when you see the struggle that some of these kids go through, even myself, people don't believe in you. And if you want to make it, you just gotta hold on.
Yeah, no doubt.
Can I bring up something? Hi, this is Dr. Washington.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm looking at the line that says "proving nature's laws wrong." This is a personal message to me, because I grew up in a public housing development, and according to the society, I was not supposed to go ahead and earn 2 master's degrees, become a principal of a school, and then earn a doctorate, because that wasn't what children who live in housing, public housing, were taught to do. And now, as a mother, I have twins, and they're 16 years old, boy and girl. I took them back to that community because I wanted them to see how humble beginnings brought this rose that came out. And that's why it was so important for me to be part of this conference, because so many kids who grew up in housing development don't have that hope, don't have that parent. Fortunately, I had a strong African-American mother who was single at one time and said, "You're going to go to school." And I grew up writing my name, Dr. Vanessa. and then added my last name. And as my dreams start to unfold, I am who I am today. So
yes.
I think that was such a real statement. It says that nature says we're not supposed to make these accomplishments. It's unbelievable that anyone can come out of that type of living to accomplish what we have done.
No doubt.
I just want to share that dreams do come true. You know, they come true, and we need to teach our children this every day.
Absolutely.
That, you know, don't let where you come from be the ending of your life.
That's right.
And, you know, especially going through the times we're going through right now, kids are losing hope. Kids are losing hope. Can I step out my door and be safe every day?
That's right.
Well, this is such a meaningful workshop right now, and I'm so glad to be part of it. I didn't mean to monopolize it. I just wanted to express that.
No, absolutely.
So, thank
you. Yeah, no doubt. And so I want to pivot to the previous point, because I think that oftentimes we operate without considering context, right? And the thing that I will say is that the current situation is not new, right? And it could go back even further than Emmett Till. It can go back further than even Trayvon and everything in between, right? And I want to use this to ground us, because education is about justice, right? And it's important to understand that when you step into a classroom as an educator, you're doing justice work. You're standing on the shoulders of the elders. You're standing with the ancestors at your back, pushing you forward, and you're standing with the ancestors providing you protection. Because if you're a educator who believes that this is a tool of liberation and justice, they coming for you, right? Like, it's not a matter of when or if, it's just a matter of like peeking around the corner and just keeping your head on a swivel, because they're coming, right? And part of what I want to talk about is just my time as a researcher, and I still continue to collaborate with folks on a lot of the research on working in urban schools, but also using this as a space to share context, but also give a sacred and a safe space for folks to laugh, cry, cuss, whatever you need to do, whatever emotion and spirit moves you. And so with this piece, my time as an academic at Loyola and at Johns Hopkins, where I was a researcher, was all about me search. And good friend, homie, who does a lot of work in the Latinx space and critical race theory, Jason Irizarry, talks about me search and the exploration of self through the lens of research. And so what frames my continued passion for research and my continued passion for being an activist researcher and an engaged practitioner researcher goes back to the upper right corner, being from Detroit and being raised by a mother and a father who both went to Spelman and Morehouse. But also the fact that my father was incarcerated my whole life, even though he went to Morehouse. And that's the image on the left. And because of the all of these situations, to the good doctor's point, I was deemed disposable, and some were pushing my mother to put me in special education. And she said to them, he's not special ed, he's just angry. Angry at society, angry at the prison industrial complex, and so on and so forth. And again, through that, I landed at a elite Jesuit high school as a recruit for athletics. For those that are familiar with DC, the high school was similar to DeMatha, the sports machine, but also had these high academic standards. And that really framed my desire to understand the existence of people of color in white spaces, because prior to that, I'd never gone to school with white folks. And in my neighborhood, it was just Black people in Detroit. And then the middle picture, the first article that I ever wrote was called The Empty Desk in the Third Row. And it was all about a student named Jason that I buried my 6th or 7th month as a classroom teacher in my neighborhood in Detroit. And the lessons that I learned about education came from that more so than my 4 years of undergrad at Western Michigan University. And the last thing is bringing it to the current state of affairs as you can see, my son on the left, John, is cutting my hair because of COVID. I can't go to the barbershop and things like that. And then Malcolm, who is 3, has his crayons that are his skin tone, which is important to my wife and myself. But I put these pictures there because this frames why I do the work, why I have done the work for so long, because I know at the end of the day, I need to look at them and make sure that I'm helping to create a world that they can survive and navigate, even though their humanity is often questioned by far too many people. So this is the context of what I will present. It's based on 13 years of research in different spaces, largely suburban school districts, urban schools, and elite private schools and Catholic schools. And I really want to dig into the complexity of the African-American male experience in American schools and colleges, just to give folks some ways to think about it for those that are heading into and considering education, to help them process, but for those of us who are already out of the university and either in a classroom, in an administrative position, or some other space, make sure that I leave time to ask questions, because obviously I couldn't put everything in here, 13 years of research, into an hour. And I want to make sure that we leave time for questions during the, looks like 43 minutes that we have left. And so feel free to stop me, ask a question, clarification along the way. So this is like call and response. Raise your hand if you know call and response tradition. Everybody good? Call and response. It's not like the classroom, Eurocentric approaches to education. Raise your hand like, you know, everybody good? This whole video thing is new to me. All right, Arthur, cool, right? I see some thumbs up, all that, perfect. So your assignment right now is I want you to respond to these 3 prompts. Write down 3 ways you believe society views Black men and boys. Write down 2 things you have witnessed in society or in schools that marginalize Black men and boys. 3, write down 2 amazing things you know about Black men and boys. And I'll give you 3 minutes to do so. A minute per.
Can you repeat those?
Yes, I can. Write down 3 ways you believe society views Black men and boys. 2, write down 2 things you have witnessed in society or in schools that marginalize Black men and boys. 3, write down 2 amazing things you know about Black men and boys. I'll give you 3 minutes. A minute and a half. $45 seconds. All right. So I want folks to just chime in. I want to give us about 7 to 9 minutes to just chat, right? Like choose one and tell your story, own your truth. As you think about these 3, you don't have to go in order. You can do it circular in nature. But I also want to ensure that we leave space for folks to go off task and use this as a healing moment for yourself. The First Nations people and then we rest our feet on their land. Use this idea of a healing circle is what I want this to also serve as we move throughout this presentation. So I'll open it up. Let's make sure we respect space and place and give folks an opportunity that we haven't heard from. So go ahead, Arthur.
Just a quick suggestion. So within Zoom, we can have breakout rooms for a much smaller discussion because we have about 91 people on
91 people?
Yeah, so we can do 5 to 6 per room. So I can do 15 breakout sessions.
Oh, if you're gonna do that, Arthur, go ahead. Like I'm not driving. So
I don't know how long you want us to have this.
7 to 8 minutes.
Okay, I'll create the room then.
Man, that's kind of like fancy tech. I didn't know you. Oh man. I'm joining breakout room 6. Got it. Okay.
Okay, so I'm joining breakout.
Okay. So I think we can all just unmute ourselves in this breakout session. Which is totally fine. Sorry, I'm just trying to monitor the other rooms, make sure everyone is saying one. Okay. All right, so I guess we can just go ahead and start. Anyone want to start on a 3-way society view? Black men or boys?
Yeah, I can start. I thought it was pretty obvious to put down the like a lot of people see or like there's a stereotype of like Black men in general are like up to no good. And so I tried to think of other things. And I kind of thought of this, you know, it's stereotypical that Black people in general are better at athletics. And so thinking about Black boys, it's kind of this idea that like if they're not good at athletics, well, then they're, you know, kind of a lost cause when it comes to like college, because you think about scholarships and how, you know, that's how a lot of stories get told of that's how someone got into college.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I can relate to that experience. Like the entire time I was in college, the first thing they would ask, like, "Oh, you play a sport?"
Mm-hmm.
So I automatically thought of that, and then as always as criminals too, and then as people who are destroying their communities. So those are like the top 3 things that I saw. Is like they're always focused on like your physical attributes, and what you can do, whether it be like music, entertaining, or being athletic. So those are the things that came to my mind about how we are represented.
I also put that I think some people, just because of the different ways that people speak, can view Black men as uneducated, even though they aren't. It's just like a certain dialect that some people use versus others.
Anyone else?
I wrote down very similar things just because I think with what's been going on recently, it's more apparent than ever. Like if you just go on Facebook, it's more apparent than ever what some people think of young Black boys and men. So yeah, like I put down the sports aspect as well, also for number 2. The second question about, that's another sports aspect, just because it feels like that seems to be the only avenue to college. And that's, not true. But
Yeah, and I think with the schooling part, I talk about how first thing that I wrote down was how to take advantage of like the physical abilities, and then to disregard like the mental capabilities of Black men and boys. So like in school, like they push people to do sports. Oh, you got to do sports first. You got to do sports to get out. But then it's like, what about the intellectual capability, right? Where we should be focusing on that, them more developing that too, along with that physical attribute, so that if something happened to them, if they get injured, they can rely on their brain and that intellectual capability. So that's what I basically wrote down for that one.
I think to add on to that, the idea that like they are almost, or like society is like training these people or these Black boys to just like focus solely on sports. Yes, it's like focusing on intellect too gives them something to fall back on, but just the idea that they're forcing them through this like funnel of you have to be athletic is already telling them that like if you're only intellectual, that's not gonna cut it in this world, or it's not gonna help you. And so it's just toxic in all ways.
Mm-hmm. Hey, D'Angelo, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay.
So what I wrote down first, the 3 ways that society views Black men. Me being a Black man myself, so I experienced some of this being in the world, coming from my neighborhood and experiencing it at a PWI because I attend Stetson University in DeLand, Florida, and just me picking up. I think society views us as threats, predators, and like people with malintent, who's malicious, who just wants to seek out vengeance or evil to other people. And I don't think it's true. I definitely do think that there are people within our community that do wrong things, just like in any community, not just Black people. So when you focus on Black and brown people and that stereotype, I think you're wrongfully categorizing them.
I don't know if we're moving on to the next thing of like what we've witnessed.
Yeah,
but
we can talk about that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, something that I wrote down is that like to go off of what was last said of like, they're seen as like people with malintent. Something that I've witnessed is that like Black boys are just more respectful almost. I think that there's like a stereotype of like disrespectful white boys, whatever. But I think when it comes to like society seeing Black young men as this like negative image, I think a lot of mothers and fathers too, but I think mothers will raise their children to be respectful, almost to go to the like other extreme of like, you can't give someone any reason to like target you. So it's almost like they have to, like my mother runs a food pantry. And so there was a family that came through, and my mom was really moved by them because these Black boys were very much the yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. And it's something that she doesn't experience with a lot of other people. And so it was like this, eye-opening, something that she's seen before, but it was very much this evidence of like, people are taught to be so much more respectful because it's like, if they aren't, then, that just gives other people another reason to fit them into this stereotype that isn't valid.
Do we want to move on to the last one? I think we have like about a minute 45 left. So for me, I said being adaptable. So that kind of relates to like the title, like the revised title of this workshop, The Rose That Grew Out of Concrete. It just, for me, like being a Black man and growing up, like being a Black boy, is being able to adapt to the circumstances that you were born into, and to like this world, right? Whereas once you get up and you're going outside, you got to be able to adapt to whatever situation you're going in, because automatically people are already judging you and they have this stereotype in their mind too. So it's like, how do you adapt to that so you can be inclusive and be part of a community that has been rejecting you for so long? And so I think we're going to head back.
Everyone back?
People are slowly coming back.
Okay, Arthur.
Yeah. I try to keep us on time, so it's like right after.
Yeah, I'm looking like 12:33. So I want to leave time for us to have some questions and things like that. So, yeah. So I'll pick up the pace. Everyone back yet, Arthur?
Let me see here. Yeah, for the most part.
Man, you can track people? Man, that's like Big Brother type stuff. All right, cool. So I will continue. And again, feel free to chime in, ask questions, and stop me. But I'm going to end a little bit early so that we have some time for some Q&A. Also provide folks with a couple of resources during this process. So as you think about what you described, right, and what you laid out, I want to bring back to the research and what we know. And this was probably 2014. We did a massive study, my colleagues at Johns Hopkins and I, to look at how are African-American males described by the media, by movies, literature, and public discourse, right? And these 8 terms came up most common, right? And the opposite of these came up least often, right? And so the interesting one that is fascinating is this uneducated piece. You have the drug addicted piece. And so part of what we're seeing is the way that many African-American men, and you can extrapolate this out to all sorts of intersectional spaces with Latinx, girls are often viewed as being very quiet, which oftentimes means they're overrepresented in special education, as an example, not because they need to be there, but because they don't stereotypically say anything, right? And so you can apply all of these things in different ways to different groups of communities of color. And I just want to, again, acknowledge the intersectionality of space and place. And so within this context, as a part of our work, we talked about what is it that they see of themselves and how do they think people around them view them. And one of the things that came up, and this is really important, because when we think about measuring teacher effectiveness in education, but also teacher quality, how do we measure whether a teacher cares, believes in students, and has expectations and high expectations? I would argue that we don't do that very well, if at all. How do we do that when we admit folks into teaching, right? Are we looking for these things, right? The other pieces that came out of the research is that they talked about the hurt that many of them felt, not necessarily physically, although we're seeing in society right now the physical harm that's done to Black and brown bodies. But for them, it was also this hurt of hearing these negative stereotypes and these negative things that are deficient, immoral, lazy, and et cetera. And when that is poured upon you, you get what's called allostatic load, which I'll talk about from a theoretical space to give us an understanding of the psychology of this here briefly. And again, if you have a question or a comment, feel free to chime in. Not all 91 people at the same time, but if there were a half dozen that chimed in all at the same time, that's a good problem to have. So I talked about the feeling, right? And I want to go to this space where we talk about theory meeting practice, right? And the accumulation of multiple negative stressors without the resources to cope gets us to this space where we're talking about allostatic load. And this refers to the wear and tear on the body that results from either too much stress or inefficient management of that stress, right? And in Miller and McCune, in Racism, Sit and Toll, it's really important to understand this because this impacts the ways in which we interact with people of color, not just in schools, but in the workplace. And what happens is this allostatic load reaches its peak when the racial microaggressions occur in a triangulated format: society, schools, and community, right? And then you have in there a space around individual racial microaggressions, adding an additional layer to this space. I would encourage everybody to read that particular text because it's really important to help us name and frame what we are seeing oftentimes when we intersect with the lived experiences, not just of Black men and boys, but a variety of folks in communities of color. So additional to that, with this allostatic load, it also is important to understand, how do people think about Black men and boys in society? And it's what we call as a deficit paradigm, right? And within the context of schools, this deficit paradigm has all sorts of issues, and there's all these different factors to it. But part of the key is that when we think about this deficit paradigm, people use these pseudoscientific arguments for cultural, intellectual, social, and emotional inferiority of said group, right? And we can apply this not only to Black men and boys, but all sorts of groups of people of color. And what happens is that when you get into this space, oftentimes for people of color, they begin to believe it. And they start to sometimes have this like acting white space, right? And this is where we know of Claude Steele's work around stereotype threat, where it actually plays into how folks perform in academic spaces. So we got about 6 minutes, and I want to try to get through a couple of things so that we can have time for questions and some dialogue. The other thing that we know, especially in schools, is that the context for Black boys with this whole disproportionality, here are some spaces where we know that it plays out. But I also want to get to this idea of low expectations and an incongruence between pedagogy and the way young people learn. For example, if young people are into technology, how often are schools digging into the advances of educational technology to help support young people, right? And now, keeping in mind that there are budgetary limitations to a lot of this stuff, which gets us to issues of systemic racism and the funding issues that plague many schools that are hyper-segregated for Black and brown young people. What are we doing about this through the work that I'm a part of with my team at Urban Teachers? Part of it is through the Black Educators Initiative and refocusing our work on African-American male teachers. And in this space, you have two big buckets. You have recruitment and you have retention. And I've always said to people, recruiting Black teachers is not enough. Saying we want to diversify the teaching force through recruitment isn't enough. You also have to have intentional effort to retain them, support them, but also think through this space with what's the narrative that we tell about going into education? Where do we place them so that they don't feel racially isolated? With Urban Teachers and our $25 million grant from the Balmer Group, we are working with UNCF to provide scholarships to support Black educators who want to go into the profession. And it is our hope that many people on this call will decide to pursue education. Urban Teachers is just one vessel. Urban Teachers is not the only pathway to becoming a teacher in your community. We work in DC, Dallas, and Baltimore. For me, as someone who's been in education over 20 years, I just want people to become teachers. You can do it through Urban Teachers. You can go to Boston, go through the Boston Teacher Residency Program. You can do it directly at your university. the goal of our work at Urban Teachers is to provide a space for those that reach college, are unsure about whether they want to go into education. They reach that point of no return with your major, and you can't go back and major in education. We provide you with an opportunity through our work, but also the scholarship is key. Within this context, I want to play a brief video. I'm hoping it actually plays because it captures the work. And so, Arthur, can you chime in if folks can't hear it or see it? Arthur? Yes? Okay, cool. Arthur, can you hear it? Say it again.
I think you might have to unplug your...
Oh, headphones.
Yep, yeah. There you go.
What's that, Arthur?
Imagine every child that comes to school whole leaves whole. What if all teachers believed deeply about all Black and brown students? And what if, you know? Well, we often have white teachers teaching content from a white perspective, curriculum that's been whitewashed to Black and brown students. How do you think that's going to impact student engagement in their relationship with the educational process?
We need to have teachers who are not only reflective of the students that we serve, but also have a cultural IQ that allows them to understand, is it connecting to the lived experiences of your students in urban America? My challenge to white teachers is, are you willing to do that?
So just imagine if there's a teacher that's aware of this. That's not just thinking, I'm not a racist, but that they're consciously thinking that I am going to fight racism. I'm going to fight racism through my lesson planning. I'm going to fight racism through the outcomes I'm pushing for. I'm going to fight racism for how I manage my classroom. If there are teachers who are thinking that way, that is revolutionary.
Last year, my son was in second grade, and he had his first Black teacher. He comes home and says to me that she was retiring. He was devastated. And he says with great clarity, Daddy, for the first time since I've been in school, my teacher believed in me. So for me, the work around recruiting Black educators into schools is personal.
This is a rallying call for far more Black people to consider teaching, to transform the trajectories of youth around them, to be vanguards in the classroom that the students are calling out for. Just consider becoming the teacher that you wish you had and knew you needed.
Part of the beauty.
So I'll stop there so that we don't run out of time. But I just want to shout out my homeboy, Sharif El-Mekki. He's another person I would encourage folks to look up, as his organization is doing amazing work as well. But this video captures the essence of much of my research, my time as an academic, but also my current work with urban teachers. In this context, wait a minute, here we go. So in this context, I'll quickly go through these last pieces so we have some time. That as you think about your work, it's important to understand the macro, meso, and microstructural issues. And I'll email this to Arthur so he can share it out. Because these key elements here help us understand the levers of change, right? And one of the things I've been spending more time on recently as someone who comes from a history of folks in the civil rights movement and protesting and things like that is part of the lever of change that we have to see in the current state of affairs has to happen at the macro, meso, and microstructural levels in order to effectuate both policy changes changes of ideologies, of exclusion, but also changes within institutions when we start to think about federal policy. So when we think about the work, it's important to keep in mind at the core of what we're doing is how we think about students, families, communities, ourselves, and each other, right? And it's not just this transactional piece that I want to pull us into, but I really want us to be reflective about how we think about those that we sell, but most importantly, how we think about our own identity development. And I always say that if you don't love yourself, you can't love somebody else's child and be an amazing teacher, right? And so we have to be in tune with our own struggles and our own challenges as we enter into this space. I want to fast forward to this last slide here because we got about 13 minutes and I don't want Arthur to kick me off just yet. There are two ways that I'm asking folks to show up when working on behalf of young people of color. This is not exclusive to Black boys. This isn't exclusive to any particular group, whether we're talking First Nations people, Latinx sisters who are going into STEM, Black women going into STEM, Asian brothers and sisters, right? Is this idea of sympathy and empathy, right? And when we have sympathy for young folks, we operate with this deficit paradigm. We have a savior complex, right? And to be transparent, all you have to do is turn on every urban education quote unquote movie, the Ron Clark story, Dangerous Minds, Freedom Riders, to see what happens when the missionary ideology shows up, right? And we start to see people lowering their expectations and limitations in students. And instead, what I'm challenging folks to do is to take on this ethos of empathy, where we see assets in students, see promise and possibilities in students, but also hold students accountable. But as adults, we got to hold ourselves accountable to understanding what is our moral compass when we're operating in a space that anti-racism is normative and we stand out and speak defiantly about issues of race and all of the other intersectional identities and intersectional challenges that we face as a society. So I'll stop there because we have 11 minutes left and I want to respect folks' time. And I will end screen share and take some questions and some feedback and things that people have for me to be helpful.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Like I want to speak to a point that the video that you showed was talking about.
Yes, ma'am.
It was talking about, and I just like want your personal opinion on it.
Yeah.
It was talking about, you know, how helpful, I guess, like the recruitment of like teachers of color can be. But I was like taught that like the recruitment of teachers of color is not necessarily like the solution to like equitable classrooms.
Absolutely.
Rather because right, like
it's a part of the solution.
Yeah, like so
right.
What I was taught is that the majority of teachers in our educational system are white women, and those numbers are only growing. Yeah. And so like rather than recruiting teachers of color, you just like white women teachers should participate in anti-racist education,
right? Because
teachers of color oftentimes in schools also enforce white supremacist ideals.
Real talk. So I would argue that it's a both and, right? Like I think that part of it is as organizations, and I think that in my career, I've always advocated for just that, right? And definitely want to encourage folks to go check out what Paul Gorski is doing at the Equity Literacy Institute, where he provides, and I'll put it in the chat box because I know that's what Arthur's going to be like, dude, put it in the chat box. So I put it in the chat box with the Equity Literacy Institute because it does just what you're describing. But it's also a both and because statistically and data has shown us that teachers of color have a significant impact on other young people of color wanting to go into the profession, right? So it's also about this idea of longevity and ensuring that we build this this pipeline into space and place. So you're not wrong. I just think it's an and, right? Like it's a both and of educating white educators and enhancing their understanding of anti-racism as a critical tenet of the work and moving beyond cultural competency, right? And some people have heard me say before, it's like cultural competency is a low bar.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm always telling people, like, don't come to me telling me about cultural competency, because I don't believe in that. Right. Because I'm competent enough to brush my teeth. But that does not necessarily mean I have the skill nor the will to put in a filling in Milton Munoz's mouth. Milton would not want me to do that. I'm hoping you would want me to do that, Milton, right? But I'm competent enough to help you brush your teeth. But I'm not skilled enough to do all these other things. And I just think that thinking about the work around having a cultural IQ, the last thing I'll say about that is looking at the work of Gloria Ladson Billings. One of the seminal texts is Dream Keepers. Also making sure that y'all go read Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I always tell folks, if you come into a classroom and you working with me and you've never read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you got to bounce, right? Like you can't teach my two boys if you don't understand that education is about liberation. So we got 8 minutes. So
thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, no doubt. And I put my email address in the chat box. Feel free to hit me up. I see Joshua. And so if you need it, feel free to ping me. I answer emails pretty efficiently. And if I don't, send me another one and tell me that I didn't answer yours, and I won't even be offended.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am, Melissa.
I was wondering if you could speak on the school to prison pipeline, because I know that that was a conversation that I had a lot in high school with fellow people of color. And I think since you obviously did a lot of research in that and in urban areas, can you talk about that and your experience with it?
Yeah. So I want to first put out there that this is not the official position of urban teachers. This is my research experience. I don't believe in the school to prison pipeline, right? But what I mean is that is there a pathway from school to prison? Sure. But I think it's more complicated than that, right? I believe in the nexus of school to prison, where schools and prisons become one and the same. Right? Dead Prez has a song called Day School, and he talks about this, the people who control the prison system control the school system. Why? Because prison systems use third grade reading scores. This is a fact, to determine the number of prison beds that they need in X, Y, and Z years, right? And so my thing for educators is, how do we ensure that schools don't replicate prisons, right? And again, I'm not suggesting that the data and the research around disproportionality and special education and being Black and brown girls being pushed out of schools and suspensions and expulsions does not lead to or make you more inclined to end up incarcerated. What I am saying is that as we understand the carceral state of America and the carceral state of education, schools oftentimes take disciplinary frameworks from prisons and apply them to schools and call it discipline and call it needing to make sure that there's order. And what happens is, when we operate in this space, like, we end up understanding that there's some behavior, law and order behavior, which we've heard lately, that appears in schools, right? This punitive discipline. So I guess I should go back and say, it's not that I don't believe in the school to prison pipeline. I just think that it's more complicated than that, because if we want to avoid the school to prison pipeline, right? Just putting that out there in quotation marks, Melissa, we have to also deal with the nexus of schools and prisons, because if we create prison conditions inside of schools, we know that prisons don't rehabilitate brothers and sisters that are locked down. They create better criminals and better inmates. That's what they do, right? Because they've gotten rid of GED programs, all these other things that can help rehabilitate a person inside of the criminal justice prison industrial complex, I should say. So check out Dr. David Stovall, Melissa. I'm gonna put his name in chat box.
Thank you.
Put him on YouTube, and he talks a lot about the nexus of schools and prisons.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Other thoughts? 4 minutes left. Shout out to my urban teachers colleagues who are on the call. Definitely want to shout them out. I see Elle Jackson. She didn't even know I could see her, but I'm just scrolling through the list, and I just want to give all of y'all a shout out. And I had a posted on Twitter today where somebody actually said for me to be safe. And I'm like, I'm not safe. My boys aren't safe. And so I definitely want to give a shout out to all those co-conspirators in the work who are white and want to move us away from naming things as allyship, but talking about being co-conspirators for justice and liberation. So other questions that may have, I see Christopher Wilson, shout out Christopher. Don't know you, but my cousin is named Christopher, so got love for that and all that. Other thoughts, questions, feedback?
I had a question. What inspired you to become an educator, and what kept you going, like in the face of challenges?
Yeah, my senior year of high school, I had to do this service project, and I did a service project at an elementary school. And, you know, I walked in like, I'm not trying to deal with no third graders. Are you kidding me? Somebody actually does this as a profession? Nah, man, I'm good on that. Like just crying, complaining. Now I'll admit I was never an elementary school teacher because I'm not blowing noses and like, that's just not my thing. I was a middle and high school teacher, right? Which is a whole other set of issues. And so that was my inspiration, right? But also the fact that I actually had Black teachers growing up in Detroit, right? So when I got into education and decided to, even now, when I think about the history of the work around diversifying the teaching force, when I first started, I was like, what you mean? Like, that's an issue? Because that's what I had growing up in Detroit in segregated schools until I got to high school. I didn't know any better, right? I think in terms of keeping going, it was always about having a network of people that you can go to. You know, you can't go alone, right? The minute you go alone, it's a wrap because you'll become a target. But you also have to know that when you do this, like you have to understand that there's a price to pay, right? And that's what I've said to young brothers and sisters here in DC, where I've done mentoring about protesting. I'm like, look, I've done it. My mother has an FBI file. Like, she's never owned a home because of her history of protesting and all this other stuff when she was in the civil rights movement. And she's okay with that because she paid the ultimate price for the struggle, right? The struggle being me, the struggle being the people, right? And so I think for me, it's also important as an educator to know that there's a price to pay. You might lose your job if you get on social media, but like, if you believe that the struggle is righteous, and Talib Kweli said it's a beautiful struggle, you have to do it, but do it in solidarity with brothers and sisters from different spaces and places. Do it with your co-conspirators who are white. And again, some of my greatest co-conspirators in this work were white folks, right? Like I used to have this homie, Robert Carpenter. He's a statistician. We used to sit in faculty meetings, a white guy. I used to have to kick him under the table and say like, bro, you can't say that to these white people. He's like, no, because if you say it, they're gonna come for you. I already got tenure, X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, bro, are you kidding me? And he used to just go in. He like, look, I'm getting down, right? And I think part of it is having that type of work with your white co-conspirators where they're like, look, I'm gonna push all of my white privilege chips to the center of the table. And for me, I'm willing to push all of my social capital into the center of the table to help protect and work on behalf of co-conspirators who are white and Black, brown, and indigenous and Asian folks who are committed to this work. Because the reality of it is now I'm not going out and protesting because I got a wife and 2 kids and I can't get coronavirus because we don't have people who can take care of our kids. But I will help folks navigate it. I will donate money. I will make sure that I show up and provide masks and gloves and water, make sure that my son understands the history of it, right? So I think that it's also, in closing, important to understand that protest isn't just about marching. There are multiple ways that protests can happen. And I fully support those that march and protest because that's the history of movements. So sorry, Arthur, I ran over. Everybody feel free to ping me on Twitter. Blake, hit me up. I like your shirt. I see my colleague Nina Cameron. Shout out to my people, and you know, love to everybody. Please do what you can for the movement. And again, any way I can be helpful. If you just need to cuss, you need to cry, send me an email. I'm on the phone on Google Hangouts because I got a lot of cussing and fussing that I need to do myself. and it's very therapeutic. So I appreciate y'all. Peace and love.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you.